Then I put those aside and I ran off a set on Gethsemane. So we're going to study Gethsemane. I've talked a lot about it. I want you to see mentally what is involved in Gethsemane because I'm breaking tradition here when I say that there's no such thing as the Garden of Gethsemane. Many songs, poems, stories have been written about the Garden of Gethsemane. Many sermons have been preached on the Garden of Gethsemane. And so in breaking that mold, I think we need to educate ourselves more on what Gethsemane is. I gave a DVD, loaned a DVD to Ken and he will actually see a Gethsemane and see the operation. It's an olive oil operation, always in a cave underground. It had to be protected from the inclement, the elements. And he will actually see this Gethsemane in action. And and you others are entitled to view that DVD if you want to when he gets through. But let's have our prayer first. Josh, would you lead us in this prayer, please?
Gather together and study another portion of your word. Father, we ask you to be with us throughout this class, be with Ken, see presents material study to us, and we'll all be able to take what we learned today and watch our lives, Father. Father, I ask you the teachers and kids in the back, and be with them as they go through their class, and we ask you to be with us throughout the rest of this day, and produce your center, and produce that right.
Thank you. I've enjoyed teaching. I hope you've enjoyed it and have learned some things. There's still a lot of information I'm having to scoot over to teach everything in a limited. I've had 9 months and I still call that limited. But anyway, before we get started on Gethsemane, and thank you very much, Carl, for passing these out. Oh, you need some more? Oh, thank you. I want to touch on 2 things. Number one, this morning I was telling my wife, she hears this all the time. I guess she gets a little tired of it. When I study something, I'm excited and I share it with her. And that is when the Israelites left Egypt and they proceeded toward the Sinai Peninsula, they passed a town that was called Timnah, Timnah. It was a heavy, to this day, they're still producing copper out of that mine. To this day, from the Exodus and turquoise, there is a temple to Hathor, the cow goddess. They had Aaron fashion the cow and not any other. Scholars believe that cow was no more than a foot tall. And yet we've seen on movies the cow this tall, haven't we? Think about it. Moses pulverized that cow. And then he strew the residue into the river. How could he pulverize a 4-foot cow? All right? So it makes sense. Anyway, turn to Exodus 6. I was teaching you about the Paschal Supper. And at the Paschal Supper, Jesus passed one vessel of wine, right? And then what? When he handed that vessel to John, who sat in the first seat, what did John do with it? He poured it in his individual cup. All right. All right. Jesus is the second seat. He's host. He's the one passing this vessel. Then Judas is sitting in the third seat. What does Judas do? He pours it in his cup. And on down, each apostle had their individual cup. And during the passing of the four cups, remember in Exodus 6, 6, and 7, there were four promises that God made to the Israelites. After Jesus passed the first cup, he said the first promise. That was given way back in Exodus. When he passed the vessel the second time, he repeated the second promise. The third cup, the third promise. The fourth cup, the fourth promise. So in Exodus 6, verses 6 and 7, again, here are the promises that Jesus reiterated at the Paschal Supper. I will bring you out from under the burdens of the Egyptians. All right? I will bring you out. Remember that. I will rid you out of their bondage. I will redeem you with an outstretched arm. I will take you to me for a people. All right. Look at that last one. I will take you to me for a people. In the book of Genesis, and I've got the scriptures, but I'm not going to get into them right now. It is said that Isaac took Rebekah. Abraham and Nahor took them wives. All right? Jacob took Leah. The word take or took in Hebrew is marry. So Abraham and Nahor married them wives. Isaac married Rebekah. Jacob married Leah. So what did God do with his people? I will marry you. When did he do that? When did God marry Israel? They were betrothed. And their courtship was the 40 days that it took to leave Egypt and get to Sinai. That was the courtship. On Sinai, he married them. And he gave them a marriage contract called a ketubah. All right, Ketubah. That ketubah was the 10 Commandments. That is why God was so angry with them. We use human terms. Deity doesn't have emotions like we do. But these human writers can only use human terms. Otherwise, we can never conceive of God. So the writer says God was angry with them because they brought in other gods. They broke the contract. They were unfaithful. And on and on and on. I could teach several weeks just on this one point. That's the thing I want you to remember. I took you to me for people. I married you. And you were unfaithful to your marriage contract. Now, in Jewish weddings, they don't say vows. They don't say vows. They write them down. And then in a very, very fancy ceremony, they sign these vows. So on Sinai, there was that ketubah. God wrote these conditions down. All right, Gethsemane. Do you have any questions to ask on what I just said? All right. Leaving the Seder, and that's how you pronounce it, the Hebrews pronounce it, not Seder. Leaving the Seder or the Paschal Supper, Jesus crosses the Kidron through bloody water on his way to Gethsemane on the slope of the Mount of Olives. The Mount of Olives was a 2-mile ridge coming off the central mountain range. There were 3 summits, and Olivet was the highest of the 3 summits. There were valleys on the north and the east and the south, I should say from your perspective, the east and the south of Jerusalem, which protected this holy city from invaders. And this is one of the predominant reasons God chose this seemingly God-forsaken area to work his plan of redemption through the Hebrew people. They had plenty of protection. All right. So they went to a place on Mount Olivet where they had been staying. Now remember, Luke says, as they were wont, W-O-N-T. That's a Greek word that means as was their habit. They went to Gethsemane every night the last week of his life. The last week of his life. They taught in the temple every day, and then Jesus and the apostles all went to this Gethsemane cave where they spent the night. They didn't go to the garden to spend the night. Then what does Jesus do with these 8 apostles and these 3 apostles? Judas not being with them. All right. When he leaves Gethsemane, he tells these 8 to stay there. Okay? You stay there. They did not leave. I mean, Luke says this. Luke says this. And then he takes Peter, James, and John, and where do they go? All right. Quote, to pray yonder, King James. The Greek says this is a future tense. He is not praying in Gethsemane. He leaves Gethsemane and goes yonder to pray. Praying is yet ahead of him. Okay. It was a full moon, since the Seder is always on 14 Nisan, the month being marked by the moon. That day may vary. It might be a Monday this year. It might be Tuesday the next year. It might be Friday the next year. But it's always the 14th of Nisan, and the 14th of Nisan was always the full moon. Always the full moon. Present near Mount Olivet is the largest. Now you're going to drop your jaws on this. Present near Mount Olivet is the largest Jewish cemetery in the world, 35 million graves. Now, these graves can be seen to this day. But when Jesus and the apostles leave the upper room where they had the Paschal Supper, and they cross the brook Kidron, that was a bloody stream of water. How do I know that? What had just taken place? The slaughter of tens of thousands of lambs. Where does the blood go? In the Kidron Valley. And this is another reason God chose this area. It was conducive to all the blood of these animals sacrificed. Tens of thousands of animals every year, not even counting the Passover. In the archives of Nero, scholars have found this, and they have deciphered these archives. Nero recorded that at one Passover, 256,000 lambs were slain. Where does all that blood go? It goes in the Kidron Valley. So when Jesus and the apostles went down into that 114-foot ravine, now later on, the Kidron Valley gets over 600 feet deep, but right there where Jerusalem, the temple is, it's 114 feet deep. They are wading through blood. What do you think that does to Jesus' psyche? What's going through his mind? His blood going to be shed in less than 24 hours. All right. What do you think is going through his mind when he passes through this cemetery with 35 million graves? He is going to be in his own grave in less than 24 hours. And that's what the Greek word ekthambos means. That Jesus, was stressed out. And I'll teach that on another day. So again, the Bible never talks about the Garden of Gethsemane. Olive trees were abundant in Gethsemane. Not today, okay? There are no olive trees to speak of on the Mount of Olives to this day. So they were abundant at that time in Gethsemane. Women would beat the trees with a stick. Women. Does that ring a bell to you women? What do you think the husbands were doing? They were sitting over there in the shade. The women were doing the work. Men have never changed, have they, Susan? Hey, Carl, come on. Yeah, I may not even be able to finish the lesson, Dale. All right. Causing the olives to fall off onto a cloth that was placed on the ground for such purposes. Then the men, now noted, then the men would help the women gather the olives. They knock them off the tree. Then they get up from their shady rest and they help the women gather the olives into a bag. They would gather the bags and empty them at the crusher into a trough of an implement. This is not the press. The word Gethsemane means oil press. It's the big pole coming out of a wall, and at the end of it are huge, huge weights. This is not what we're talking about. We're talking about a crusher over here where olives were poured into a cement trough, and then a big wheel was turned around and crushed them, and then they were put in these bags and put under these heavy Gethsemane weights. All right. For such purposes, donkeys were used, or they used their children. In other words, it was such a huge wheel that human beings couldn't turn it. They had to be big because this was an olive oil operation. All right. Or they hired someone to do it. The wheel squashed the whole olive, the pits, the skin, the pulp, everything. The oil would bubble to the surface. People would skim some of the oil off and offer that portion to God as what? What do they always call the first of anything offered to God? First fruits. The first fruits, the first grapes, the first olives, first wheat. Excuse me. All right. This portion was known as the extra virgin oil. That is not a typo, okay? It was called the extra virgin oil. It was the finest of all the oil. Then they would gather this pulp, put it into hemp baskets like burlap, then place the baskets under the press. So they take these squashed olives, after they skim the first off in order to offer to God, they put in these burlap bags, then they come over to the press. So it leaves the crusher and goes to the press. And then they place the baskets under a press, which is a beam which had a couple of weights on the end. Sometimes the baskets were just put under the weights alone without the beam. A huge pole, similar to a power pole, goes through a hole in the wall, serving as a lever beam to lift weights. Attached on the end of the pole by means of a pulley system. Now, these presses were lifted only a short distance. The oil, which is very thick, is forced out by the press into a chamber below where it is collected. It is then mixed with water. At the exit was a large cistern filled with rainwater. Due to the high acid content of the olive oil, acid and water mix. Acid and oil do not mix. And so the oil comes to the surface. People then skim it, and you have the finished product. This whole operation was done underground in a cave. After all the oil was pressed out of the olive, a dusty, dry residue was left. Women use this residue in their stoves. These Jews missed nothing. Everything was used. What you think is now trash, these Jewish women used for some purpose in their home life. And the same way about the threshing floor. Threshing floors were about from 60 to 75 feet in diameter. And there were 5 oxen. They preferred oxen over cattle because of the bigger hooves. 5 abreast would go around a central pole. I don't know what you call that, central pole. And then as the grain still in the stalk was threshed by these cattle, there were men who were hired to have these forks, and they'd throw it up in the air. And what would happen? The wind would blow the chaff away, and the grain would fall right back down. Now, on the smaller grain, they would flail them. They would beat them together. They wouldn't let the cattle, the hooves would ruin the grain. The women would go and gather this residue, and they would burn it in their stoves. I'm telling you, nothing was wasted. I told my son yesterday about a vulture. I've got to throw this in. A limmergeier, a vulture of Ethiopia. You wonder, what in the world is he doing now? This will be my last day, Dale. All right. Other vultures eat the meat. All right. The limmergeier comes along and gets the bones. He eats bones. He has a high acid content, but the bones are too big. And they are 7-foot wingspan from tip to tip. All right. Huge birds. Takes them 7 years to get this down. Young ones, they take the older birds take the bones 500 feet and drop it on cement, on rocks. Bust them. They eat the smaller ones and go up. They do this as many as 30 times. Takes 7 years for a young limmergeier to learn this. 7 years. Okay? What's my point? God's creation leaves nothing. Here are birds that eat the meat. And lo and behold, if he didn't create birds to eat the bones, nothing's left. The country is clean. And the same way about what we call trash after the threshing and the olive oil production. So women would use this residue in their stoves, there being just enough oil left so that it would burn very well. The oil would be stored in a cave off to the side. That's what had to be protected, okay? The whole operation took place in an underground cave. This shows everyone that Gethsemane was not a garden. And there were many Gethsemanes in Palestine. The Gethsemane Jesus and his apostles went to was not the only one. There were many of them. And do you remember the city that made Gethsemane implements? Capernaum, the headquarters of Jesus and his Galilean ministries. Now notice, on page 2, the weight suspended on the end of that long pole is called the oil press. One such press I saw, and Ken, I'm talking about, I was seeing this very video. I saw was about 5 feet high by 2 feet wide by 18 inches in diameter. However, some poles had 2 smaller weights on the end instead of the one big one. So Jesus went to an oil press. He went to Gethsemane in or near to a garden, which was on the Mount of Olives. So why did Jesus go to Gethsemane? He was under the press, enduring suffering, humiliating rejection, upcoming death, separation from his Father. Can you see how all of this fits perfectly into the life of Jesus? He passes through this bloody water. He goes through this massive graveyard. And then he goes to the oil press. And all of these things pertain to that which is coming upon him. When Jesus and his disciples went to Gethsemane, they went to an underground cave, and this is where they resided at times before the crucifixion. John 18, 1 and 2. Some owner may have offered them this place rent-free, or maybe they rented it for a small fee. We just don't know. The disciples are in Gethsemane, the press. Jesus leaves Gethsemane. He goes into a garden. He prays in the garden, not in Gethsemane. Now, notice Mark 14:33. Jesus, it said of Jesus, began to be sore amazed and to be very heavy. That sore amazed is that Greek word ekthambos, which I'm not going to get into right now. Now, here are the verses. Matthew 26:36, then cometh Jesus with them unto a place called Gethsemane, and saith unto the disciples, sit ye here while I go and pray yonder. That's Matthew's account. Mark says, and they came to a place which was named Gethsemane, and he saith to his disciples, sit ye here while I shall, both Matthew and Mark deal with future tense verbs, while I shall pray. And he taketh with him Peter and James and John. John 18:1 and 26 says, when Jesus had spoken these words, he went forth with his disciples over the brook Kidron, and that's another spelling. It generally is spelled with a K, but sometimes a C, where was a garden, into the which he entered and his disciples. One of the servants of the high priest, being his kinsman, whose ear Peter cut off, saith, did not I see thee in the garden with him? There is where he was praying when this motley crew of murderers approached him before Judas did what? Kissed him. Hypocritical kiss. John 19:41, now in the place where he was crucified, there was a garden. And there were gardens everywhere, even where Jesus was crucified. In the garden, a new sepulchre, wherein was never man yet laid. Who owned that sepulchre? He was a member of the Sanhedrin. He came to Jesus by night. Nicodemus owned it. There were two Sanhedrists that became believers in Christ. Two Sanhedrists. Now, Luke 21:37. And in the daytime, he was teaching in the temple, and all of his apostles were teaching with him. That's found elsewhere. And at night, he or they went out and abode in the mount that is called the Mount of Olives. Now, the Mount of Olives is about 100 foot higher in elevation than the city of Jerusalem. Jerusalem was 2,610 feet in elevation. And that's why whenever you read in the scriptures, they went up to Jerusalem. Didn't matter what direction. I mean, they could be south of it. They could be north, east, west. You go up because it was the highest land in that area or in that region, except for Bethlehem. Bethlehem was a little higher. It was about 90, it was 2,704 feet, so almost 1,000 feet higher. All right, the Mount of Olives was higher than Jerusalem. Luke 22:39, and he came out and went as he was wont. Again, the Greek word is habit, to the Mount of Olives, and his disciples also followed him. The night of the Paschal Supper, when Israel left Egypt, was named, and we studied this last week, the night of watching. To this day, the Jews call it the night of watching. And what do they do on that night? The night of the Paschal Supper. They still have it today. That night of the Paschal Supper, they slaughter the lamb before sundown on the 14th of Nisan. But they eat the lamb after sundown, which is the beginning of the 15th of Nisan. And Jesus dies later on the 15th of Nisan in the afternoon. So what do? the night after they eat the Passover lamb. To this day, they stay up all night, except children. Children, bless their hearts, they can't stay up all night. All right, Seth, can you stay up all night? Your teenagers don't have any problem staying up all night, do they? All right. And so when Jesus, again, now remember, repetition is the mother of all learning. When you hear it and hear it and hear it, it begins to take seed. That's why Jesus was upset with his disciples when he found them sleeping. He asked them basically to stay awake 1 hour. And they couldn't even stay awake 1 hour. And all the Jews stayed up all night, but not his disciples. And that was a slap in his face. Exodus 12:42 says, "It is a night to be much observed unto the Lord." Now here is Exodus 12 is the chapter in which the Passover lamb is slain. The Jews eat the Passover lamb. They stay up all night. Why do they stay up all night? Because this is the time God is going to free them. And they don't know what hour. This is what Carl was saying. They don't know what hour. It's like when a man and a woman are betrothed. The betrothal can take place usually a year, lasts a year. The father sends out 2 invitations. Let's say that Carl and Susan are betrothed. All right? The father of the bride, Susan's father, sends out invitations to everybody. My daughter is getting married. You're going to be invited to the feast. Okay. Then he sends out a second invitation. You can decline the first one. You don't decline the second one. No, not in Judaism. And that means that the feast is in sight. See, when he sent out the first one, he had no idea when the feast was going to take place, the marriage feast. When he sends out the second one, he sees the marriage feast in sight, though he doesn't know the particular day. So he sends out that second one, and those who accept it must attend. And from the time of accepting that second invitation, you dress in your best apparel every day, because that may be the day of the feast. You don't say, "Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't know it was today. I'm going to go run in the house." No. You are ready. Now, the groom takes his bride. He goes to her father's house where she still is. He takes her, and now there is a procession that goes to his house where the marriage feast takes place. And that's why the 5 foolish virgins, the story of the 5 foolish virgins, they weren't ready. The 5 wise were ready, even though they didn't know. I'm not drunk, Seth. Even though they didn't know the particular hour, you stay ready. And how does that apply to us? We know not what hour he comes. Jesus doesn't even know when he's coming. Only the Father. Only the Father. And Jesus is going to go back to the Son. He says, "Son, it's now time. Go get your bride."
Think of the story Jesus told about the man who came into the wedding.
Yes.
He wasn't properly.
He didn't have the garments on, did he?
He wasn't properly dressed. And what happened? He was cast out.
That's right. He was cast out. And by the way, the father of the bride would furnish any garment that the people didn't have. He'd furnish. These fathers were not poor. They were not poor at all. All right, so back to this. It is a night to be much observed unto the Lord for bringing them out from the land of Egypt. When did the firstborn of Egypt die? When did God, no such thing as a death angel, by the way. It was God who did the killing. He didn't send some angel to do it. And I've got plenty of scriptures that show that. God will pass over you. He did it at midnight. And right after midnight, when Pharaoh saw the death of his own firstborn and others, he called Moses and Aaron and said, "Get out of here." Maybe not in those words, but he sent them on their way. They knew, they were ready. That's why they could not have what kind of bread? Leavened bread. Leaven takes time to rise. They didn't have time. And so they had to have unleavened bread. And thus the tradition has been passed on down through the centuries. This is that night of the Lord to be observed of all the children of Israel in their generations. And the Jews themselves call this very verse the night of watching. The night of watching. They are the ones who established the precedent. You don't go to sleep on the night of the Passover. Leaving Gethsemane, Jesus set Peter and James and John as sentinels on his way to pray yonder. Why were they stationed? He specifically says in Matthew 26:38, "Tarry ye here and watch with me." That word watch in the Greek means they were on guard duty. They weren't there to watch the birds in the trees, even though it was at night, maybe some owls floating around. They were there to watch for the coming mob. And yet they couldn't stay awake even 1 hour. All right. Any questions? Okay. All right. I don't know what Lance is going to be teaching you the next quarter, but I'm sure it will be a very interesting study. You're looking forward to it? Book of Galatians. All right. Book of Galatians. Beautiful book. I mean, I love that book. All right. Do you have any questions on anything that I have taught during these 9 months? You know, Dale and I have talked several times about this, and I try to teach my grandchildren this. What's our purpose on this earth? I mean, we're just here to have a good time, make money, and, acquire property. To prepare for our home in heaven. That's it. This is a place of preparation. The first thing, when one became a Pharaoh of Egypt, the first thing they did, the very first, authorized the building of their tomb, which was what? The pyramid. They prepared for their afterlife. That was the first thing on their agenda. And that should be the first thing on our agenda. Thank you very much. Thanks, Carl.